Good morning, good morning, good morning. My name is Pastor Jason Clausen. I'm one of the pastors here at the Open Door Church, and I want to be the first to welcome you into the new year. Happy 2021. You made it. You made it through 2020. A bit of an epic year. A bit of a cluster bomb went off in 2020. It was difficult for many of us, for many of you. For those of you who spent Christmas alone or not able to see your children or grandchildren, my heart goes out to you. I'm sure it was a very difficult Christmas for many of you. I just want you to know we've been praying for you and standing by you. And by all means, we want to encourage you to reach out to us. We would love to give you a call or a driveway chat or a little meeting or whatever is kind of open to your comfort level. You are allowed to come down to the office to some level. Please just call ahead. And we'd love to be able to connect with you sometime throughout the beginning of 2021. Now, if you've been going to the Open Door Church for any amount of time, you will know one of the things that I love to do when we begin a new year is to start a series, some sort of series, usually focusing around the concept of beginning with the end in mind. The idea that we should look forward to the end of the year, right? The end of 2021 or the very beginning of 2022, and think about the things we'd like to have done or said or accomplished or been or whatever, and then work our way backwards. And as we do, we begin to kind of in reverse lay out the steps of our year. And that's great. And that's wise, and it's helpful, and it's healthy, and I love it. And I'm going to be doing that this year, and I encourage you to as well. In fact, by far, the most viewed message on YouTube that I've ever done is from 6 or 7 years ago, entitled "Beginning with the End in Mind." But when I talk about it, and when I discuss it, and when I dive deep into it, I feel like sometimes I miss a step, which 2020 has somewhat revealed. What I'm saying is we can design a very beautiful house. We can design all of the things that matter. In fact, when we plan a house, and my neighbors are building a house, kind of finishing it up right around now, and when you start to build a house, you think about things like, how many bathrooms do we want? How many bedrooms do we want? Do we want the bedrooms upstairs or downstairs? What kind of shingles? What kind of siding? What kind of design aesthetic might we have in this house? And these are the things we often think about when we have the end of the house in mind. And then you work your way backwards to the beginning of the build, and that's great. And we've done that before as a church, as we've looked to who we want to be as a church. I've encouraged you to do that as an individual. But there can be a bit of a step missing in there that's really important. And actually, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about that step. And it's a step that I find in Western culture we're not always very good at or very diligent at. And when you sacrifice this step, which I want to talk about this morning, and I want to kind of launch us into the new year, when you begin to think and ponder this step, you begin to see the deep and abiding reason why Jesus spends so much time talking about this one concept. Because I think in times of turmoil, in times of shift, in times of change, of transformation like we've been in throughout this last year, 2020 has been a major amount of shift and change. Our focus to this one principle, our ability to leverage this one principle will show what falls away, what breaks, what dies, and what sustains and what grows. And so with such power behind this principle, I want to dive in. You see, this last year, I wasn't able to go on the Manigatogin. I usually go on a Manigatogin River Trail, and it's a canoe and camping trip. Kind of, you can do it between 2, 4, or 5 days, something like that. And I love it. I love fishing and hiking in the Canadian Shield. And when I do, one of the things I see the most is these cliff sides and these rocks with these huge towering pine trees that grow out of them. I find them so beautiful. There's, probably 8 or 10 different pine trees, but many of them grow 50, 60, 70 feet on this. It looks almost like bare rock. And I love the way this looks, and it kind of dominates the scenery. But every time a storm comes by, I notice something. a good number of those tall trees end up falling down. They get ripped by the wind, and the wind howls and the storm lashes them, and it pulls them down. And it leaves a very beautiful sight, don't get me wrong. I love the look. What will happen is these pine trees will have rooted themselves on the surface in the thin layer of soil left on the Canadian Shield. It's moss, basically, and small amounts of dirt. And when the wind comes and rips them, the roots will actually become exposed, and these large like plates of roots will hang in the air with 2 or 3 or 4 boulders that they were kind of grappling onto ripped up with them. I find them very beautiful. I love to sit in their shade and fish into the rivers and lakes underneath these kind of root shelters. But what's left behind are these little oak and scrawny little ash trees and dogwood trees and different kinds of trees, alderwood. And what they've done, and this is interesting, is rather than grow along the dirt, where the pine trees have grown in this shallow soil, what these oak trees will do is they'll send their roots down. And there'll be hairline cracks in the rock. And what they'll do is they'll shove their roots down those hairline cracks. And when it rains, then the roots will swell and kind of lock into the cracks. And then when it's dry, everything will kind of contract, and they'll send their roots down a little bit deeper. And what happens is water gets in fall, and then winter, when it freezes, it'll pry those cracks open, and those roots will go down. And year by year, by slow growth year, these roots will inch deeper and deeper and deeper. I have seen oak trees that were no bigger than me. I'm talking 5, 6, maybe 7-foot oak trees on the top of a cliff. And sometimes 10 or 15 feet below on the cliff, I'll see the tendrils of the roots sticking through the cliff, as they actually have twice as much root as they have growth on top. And they'll often struggle to get at the light because the big, giant 50, 60-foot pine trees are kind of covering them and dwarfing them. And when you look in the scenery, all you see is these pine trees. But when the storm comes, those pine trees get ripped right off of the rocky slopes they've grown on. And all that's left are deep-rooted, slow-growth, abiding oak trees. They sacrifice obvious growth for deep, abiding roots. And they survive storm after storm for generations. You see, beginning with the end in mind can lead us into a mentality where we design our life around what we want it to look like, not what we want our life to be rooted into. Now, if you read the Bible and the life of Jesus, he probably talks 10-1 about where we're rooted, because Jesus knows the principle that applies in your life. You produce fruit in direct proportion to the root. And if you focus on the growth and the obvious appearance, you run the risk of being shallow, of being easily swept aside, of being lost at the currents of culture, your currents of your own physical health, the currents of your own government or of your own time, day, and age. Whereas if you focus on your character in Christ, then regardless of your circumstances in the world, you can have a life that grows, maybe slow, but steady and sustainably, abiding deeply in something more solid than just our own hopes, plans, and dreams. In fact, Jesus says it this way. If we look at when he was talking to people during the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 7, Jesus says it this way. He says, "Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a sensible man, like a wise man who built his house on the rock." See, he's saying that people who build their house, they plan their life, they build everything around them on deep, abiding foundations, are sturdy. He says the rain fell, the rivers rose, the wind blew, and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them, Jesus says they'll be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the rivers rose, and the wind blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. And its collapse was great. See, Jesus doesn't actually promise us good times. He doesn't promise us easy times. He doesn't promise us a charmed life. He doesn't promise us health and wealth. That's not in his gospel. He says storms will blow, trials will come, tests will come, COVID will waylay your plans, and everyone will be tried by the fires of this world. See, the difference between believers and unbelievers will not be in some grand appearance of success, but that when the winds and trials of life come, those who have built their house on unfirm foundations, on sandy soil, those who have focused on outward appearances, on circumstances, and on comfort, will have those things ripped away from them. And Jesus says those who have built their lives on the things of his kingdom will have them rooted forever. The difference between believers and unbelievers is that what we do can last for eternity. What we build can matter in God's kingdom. When I was a kid in high school, I was smart enough, I didn't really need to study to get passable grades. I could get 80% on a test just kind of by showing up to class. And I'm not proud of this. I'm not bragging. I don't encourage this. And so I kind of limped through school getting just good enough to not ever have to worry. I kind of feel like it was a lost opportunity because there was many things I could have learned deeper. I had a friend. He had kind of a similar attitude. He would be able to get just enough to get by. See, and he would always blame the teachers and the school and the system that they weren't good enough. And so when we both graduated, he went on to university. I didn't. I spent 2 years in the workforce. And part of the reason why I did that before I went back to university is I felt I had developed very negative study habits, or rather, I hadn't really developed study habits. I hadn't developed a mindset of learning. I hadn't developed an educator's mindset. I had coasted through high school because it was easy enough. And I was actually a little bit embarrassed and ashamed of that. And so I wanted to spend 2 years just working and developing and changing some of my habits. He didn't. He ran on to school. He ran on to university. And what happened was he hit university, and sure enough, university's a lot harder than high school. And he struggled, and he struggled, and he struggled. And he paid large amounts of money for several years trying to get an education, but had never developed the character, the deep, abiding study habits and focus and development that were necessary to be able to handle university. What happened is after 2 years, he failed out. He washed out. He had spent about $30,000, wasted 2 years of his time, wasted his professor's time, and ended up with no degree and no education. I took those same 2 years, worked in the workforce, made some money, then I went back to university, and by that point in time, I had learned that life can be hard and you have to pay attention, and I was able to excel throughout university to at least some level, and 3 years later, I was able to graduate with my degree. The difference was, rather than the quick life plan, kind of quick growth that my friend wanted, I was able to take a few steps back and develop some deep, abiding character. So that's what we want to look at early in this year. I want to talk a little bit about character, about the fact that we can root ourselves in who Christ is, that we can root ourselves in something steadfast. Paul says it this way when he's talking to the church in Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 3, 9-15. He says, look, for we are God's co-workers, you are God's field, God's building. So I'm going to go a little bit further into that yet. But what Paul is saying is that you are God's design first and foremost. So actually, before you begin with the end in mind, you have to realize, you and I, we have to realize we are made with a God ending in mind. God has a plan and a purpose for you right now, today. This year, 2021, he has a plan and a purpose for your year. He's mapped out your year. And your map, your plans, and your purposes can look like God's, be meshed with who God is. Your roots can be locked in with the foundation of God's design for you. And I guarantee you, no COVID pandemic, no family catastrophe, no health issue in your life can waylay you off of God's foundation for your life. But you can also plan your own designs for 2021 that are apart, that are separate, or worse yet, I fear for many believers, merely on the surface of God's plan for your life. It'll look good, It'll look healthy, but when the storms come, it has a tendency to show out that to be a foolish way of building. It's on the sandy soil. It's on the surface. So Paul says, you're God's field. You're God's building. So then he goes on to say in verse 10, he says, according to God's grace that was given to me, I've laid a foundation as a skilled master builder, and another builds on it. Start first with the foundation. What's below your plans and your purposes is your character. Build your character deep into God's character. Don't just wish for circumstances to be rosy, but actually build your character into God's character. Mesh it together. Remain in the vine. Abide with Christ. And your character can be enmeshed with God's character. And then you build on it. Paul goes on to say, but each one must be careful how he builds on it. For no one can lay any other foundation than what has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on that foundation, with gold, silver, costly stone, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. Again, Paul says that fire will test the quality of each one's work. The difference between believers and unbelievers isn't in trial and testing, it's in eternal steadfastness if we've built on God's foundation. He says if anyone's work that he's worked at has built and survived. Sorry, let me rephrase that. If anyone's work that he has built survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burnt up, it'll be lost. But he will be saved, yet it will be like an escape through a fire. I'll be honest with you. I feel a little bit like I got through 2021 like someone who's escaped through a fire. I had a lot of plans and purposes and ideas, and many of them were loosely rooted in God, but some of them at least were built, I'm going to say, maybe on the surface of who God is. It was God-adjacent planning, not necessarily so much God's character enmeshed with my character in some ways. And I'm just being honest here with you. And the storms and the waves and the ravages of 2020 have come and ripped some of them right off. But some of them stayed. Some of them are built on something more solid. And that's really what I want to walk through with you, church, if I can, for the next couple of weeks. There are actually kind of three journeys that man can go through. People often talk about believers and unbelievers, and that is the grand dichotomy, right? If you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you will be saved. Certainly for those who are unbelievers, if you don't put your faith in Christ, absolutely, when the fires of testing come, it's all burnt up and there's nothing left. But for believers, for you and me, there's actually kind of two roads that can be taken. Paul says there are those who will escape as one who escapes from a fire. Everything will be ripped and burnt from us, but our little seed of salvation. There are others who will have spent their lifetime, and I pray this is you and I this year. There are others who have spent our lifetime building our characters with God, meshing our life with God in a deep and powerful way. And then the storms come, and the fires come, and the ravages come. And we're left strong and healthy when other people are swept aside. So I want to dive into a little bit this year what it means to build our houses on the rocks, to build our houses on firm foundation, to mesh our characters with Jesus. But first and foremost, we have to give up the idea that our circumstances or our comfort are God's primary concern. God's primary concern is our character, that we mesh our character with His, that we grow to look more like Christ. So, I have a lot I want to get into. I'm going to leave us this morning with this kind of cliffhanger as I'm going to unpack some of this stuff later on. This week, my challenge for you is really, really, really simple. I want you to look back on 2020. I want you to look back. I want you to imagine what you had hoped and dreamed and planned to do in 2020. And I want you to just pick out two things. Number one, I want you to pick out one thing, one hope, dream, or plan that completely failed, that got waylaid, that got delayed, that got completely burnt. You were going to go to school somewhere else and you couldn't get your passports and flights, so it all failed. Or you were going to do this big trip with your family and things closed down and they didn't work. Whatever your thing is, I want you to find one thing that you had planned, hoped, or dreamed for 2020 that didn't work. And I want you to find your one plan, hope, or dream for 2020 that grew, that developed, that flourished. And I want you to ask God. I just want you to spend some time in prayer this week and ask God, what is something about that dream, hope, or plan that failed that was outside of God's character? And what is one thing about the plan, hope, or dream that succeeded that helped root you in God's character? I'm going to use this later as we dive deeper into it, but I think for this week I want to leave you with this. Walk in those things that are God's character and ask Him to reveal to you what His plans, purpose, hopes, goals, and dreams are for your life, so that you can be a careful builder, carefully building on God's hopes and plans for your life. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I look forward to seeing you throughout the coming weeks as we unpack deeper what some of God's foundations are for you, for the church, and for ultimately His kingdom in 2021. My name is Jason Clausen. This is the Open Door Church, and I want to thank you for joining us.
Good morning, my name is Jason Clausen, and I cannot preach without jumping, otherwise it doesn't make sense because I'm a 2-year-old.